Undoubtedly, one of the more divisive elements of Nightreign has been the over-reliance of assets and bosses from the previous games, even beyond Elden Ring itself. But no doubt that gave them plenty of time to work on the most standout parts of the game, the Nightlords. While not all created equal by any means, I found some of the Nightlords to be some of the most creative and standout bosses by Fromsoft in a very long time, and I can't wait to see more of them, Everdark or otherwise. So, what makes these bosses so interesting? Well, let's get into it. Before even getting to the bosses themselves, there's a few core mechanics Nightreign itself has that instantly contributes to the dynamic between the Nightlords being quite unique. For instance, the differing builds of the characters you get to play as. In the previous games, being a melee build, a spellcaster, a healer, etc. didn't really change much about your approach. Because, let's be real here, the combat of the Soulsborne games isn't that deep. Most actions you perform are a variant of attacking, defending, or evading, just differing in buttons clicked. Nightreign is much better even in that regard, but the synergy between the different characters in multiplayer does give more opportunities for strategies, such as Recluse and Revenant being able to coordinate ults, allowing Recluse to be immortal for a brief time, especially if she took the self-bleed to buff attack, and Revenant being able to regen mana without consumables. This gives more of an MMORPG feel to the game, where you can have more dedicated roles in a party, like your usual tank and DPS and all that. It's also less restricted than the Soulsborne games, because the devs aren't as heavily restricted to have all the characters be even across the board. By that meaning things like character height being able to vary, or needing to make sure you can beat all the bosses with different roll speeds, things like that. Which might also be a side effect of there not being PvP in this game. That's usually another reason they don't want to give unfair advantages by creating short characters, for instance. But going into the Nightlords themselves, the main thing that generally makes them more interesting is how they have organic weaknesses. Most of the bosses in the Soulsborne games have some sort of elemental or status effect weakness, but generally all that means is that they take more damage from the element, or that they can be poisoned or bled. It doesn't have much interaction with the boss itself. In Nightreign, some of the bosses certainly only seem to take more damage from the weakness and that's it, such as Nostar and Maris. A few become staggered and or take more damage for a brief time, such as Gladius, Caligo, and Hailstor, still giving a definite advantage for using the specific weakness. But at its best, it adds an extra layer of complexity to the fight, such as the last 3 Nightlords I haven't mentioned yet. Gaping Jaw Adele can be poisoned pretty frequently, causing him to flinch momentarily and then puke out the poison pretty quickly. I believe Rot works similarly, as in it can be puked out by him, but maybe doesn't puke it out as soon as he gets it, and just if it happens to be poisoned. I'm not sure, I haven't used Rot enough to recall for sure, but even that alone adds another dynamic if so, allowing you to cause constant chip damage by another means. By the second phase, he won't stagger or puke out the poison anymore, which simultaneously acts as an advantage and disadvantage, since he won't flinch anymore to give you large openings to punish him, but will take constant chip damage as long as the status lasts. The most standout example of the organic weaknesses, however, is Dark Drift Knight Fulgur. For his weakness, I imagine he does take more damage from lightning than other elements, but his specific stagger animation only happens when he has his staff pointed straight up, charging up his holy staves from the ground attack, and while that animation is happening, his staff acts as a lightning rod to shock him when you attack him with enough lightning damage. That has to be the most creative display of a weakness I've ever seen by Fromsoft. It's very simple, but it's so much more than just, oh, he takes more damage from lightning. And I do wish more things like this were telegraphed by the boss design itself, or become some sort of puzzle to be able to trigger something like a stagger. It should be said that generally the weaknesses don't trivialize the fight either. It's never really that much more of an advantage to completely obliterate the Nightlords. It's just the kind of thing that gives you an extra edge on the fights. Now I skipped over Libra in the last segment because I wanted to give him a whole chapter to himself. If you're new to my channel, you may not know that I've dragged Shadow of the Erdtree's boss, Midra, quite a bit. I found it to be a very bland and generic boss fight for being the first and only Frenzy boss in Elden Ring. Frenzy being one of the major 3 endings in that game, and not to mention a huge part of the lore, I fully expected if there was to be a Frenzy boss, it'd be something much more special and unique. Something chaotic and unknowable, not just another standard boss fight with a big sword. Libra is basically everything I wanted Midra to be. Not only is it actually a very unsightly creature, up there with some Bloodborne monsters, while still feeling distinct, it also has such chaotic vibes and movesets that feel appropriate for a madness boss. But anyway, that's not even getting to some of the mechanical reasons it's fantastic. The weakness is the kind of thing that at face value, you would think doesn't make sense. But understanding that using madness spells and weapons will also cause you frenzy, it makes perfect sense that Libra's own main attack method is its own weakness, and that's always a solid concept in general. But that's not even what stands out the most in this fight. It's not super common to even get frenzy equipment, so it's certainly advised not to rely on it. What does make the fight far more interesting is the equilibrium theme. Before the fight even begins, you get a choice of a trade you can make for this final fight, in case you got a little screwed over in the actual run and may need a hand, but at the exchange of something, usually at the expense of your final stats. You may not have noticed, but you have an additional unspoken choice, whether you want to and are capable of destroying the bubble barrier during his meditation phase, or to let him fully charge the buff phase. This is a choice because not pulling him out of the bubble will buff his defense, on top of having mostly the same but more chaotic variants of the magic spells, whereas if you're able to get him out, he will get a buff to his attack, and be more physically aggressive, though he does get some new spells as well. I think generally speaking, it is more advantageous to break the barrier, but being the more difficult task, especially as the fight goes on, it does mean you won't always get to break it either, so it does require some more challenge during the actual fight, rather than being an even trade per se. When you realize all these mechanics go back to the title of Equilibrious Beast, it's perfect. Just overall, this fight felt like it got a lot of extra love by Fromsoft due to all the details and mechanics that are squeezed into this one fight, even compared to the rest of the Nightlords. Now, I didn't really mean or expect to talk about the Everdark bosses when I thought of this video. I was just going to cover the normal versions of the Nightlords. But then Everdark Sentient Pest dropped, and I love it! Everdark Darkdrift was cool and all, but it wasn't a vastly different fight from the normal version. I actually find it slightly less interesting because you can't really take advantage of the unique weakness nearly as much, but it is still a good fight. Adele might just be worse, so meh. But as for Sentient Pest, it was originally a decent idea, but somewhat mediocre and annoying fight and execution. And somehow, the Everdark version managed to turn the fight on its head. It's taken me some time to fully grasp why it feels much better, but this is at least part of what I think makes it so. The original fight started out as simply 2 damage sponges that share an HP bar, so the only real decision making that exists for it is whether one of the teammates can and will draw aggro from Noster, being the one that's airborne, or if all teammates will focus on Fartis and try to avoid Noster altogether, maybe by using Fartis' body as a shield. Then they merge and it becomes a simpler fight, even if it's not necessarily much easier. And on top of that, the fire weakness doesn't seem to have much of a unique effect on them, outside of just doing more damage. Not even a stagger as far as I remember, like Calico. The Everdark variant flips the formula by starting out with the original phase 2, which isn't that much different, but then when it comes to the new phase, this time the health bars are split, and you have the new entity, Animus, in the room, reviving the killed individual bosses. So there's a bit more decision making involved, say which one of them is better to defeat first, whether you'd want to kill them both roughly simultaneously, or whether you only really want to kill one of them throughout the entire fight. So in general, the boss fight is a little more involved, not just a matter of spamming fire at it the whole time. And this is all not to mention that the revive mechanic is a fair bit unique in itself. There have been bosses in the previous games that revive a fallen co-enemy, such as Throne Watcher and Defender, Lothric and Lorien, perhaps you could argue Witches of Hemwick, and even the Godskin Duo in Elden Ring. But save for maybe that last one, none of them are nearly as dynamic as Everdark Sentient Pest. They're either about killing both of the bosses, or there's a true boss you have to kill. Where while Sentient has a true boss, it's not just out in the open for you to be able to attack anytime. You have to draw it out by killing the other bosses. Even Godskin Duo doesn't feel that interesting, even if it has some dynamics to it, but it's mostly due to you likely already having fought these enemies at previous point. And they're not as sharply balanced for a duo fight, like previous fights in the series. Now, as much as I would like to end on a high note, there was one egregious boss that popped up pretty much as I started working on this video, making me inclined to at least address it. As I stated at the beginning of the video, not all bosses are created equal, but to me, none of the Nightlords ever dropped below like B tier for me, until Everdark Augur dropped. Now, I have a bias towards the Stormruler mechanic generally speaking, so I have no qualms with that aspect of it in particular, but the execution definitely wasn't anywhere near as good as it could be. The first problem with Everdark Maris is that he's far too tanky, pretty much regardless of how many players there are, dragging out the fight far longer than has any right to go, turning it into an endurance fight. Now, this could be tweaked to not be nearly as bad with future updates, but that alone would only make it an okay fight. it would still be far from good or enjoyable, as at least I, personally, didn't find the way the fight works to be too enjoyable nevertheless. Some further problems is that trying to destroy the orbs at half health with a normal attack is a nightmare. Unless you happen to be close enough to the boss, you pretty much just have to spam the normal attack and hope you get them. And it's certainly strongly in your interest to try to destroy them, as it staggers the boss for a long time and gets rid of an additional threat, especially during the sleep attack. The boss normal hitbox also is pretty spotty as well, but even that is at least a little bit easier to adjust, though it does still suck wasting a fully charged attack. Speaking of charge attacks, I do think the charge attack could use some tweaking. For one, I don't think it should take nearly as long as it does to charge up, and when it does, I do think it needs a slightly better audio and visual effect feedback, as in the heat of combat, sometimes you could find yourself not noticing if you were done charging, or you can't even really see on the weapon model if it's done. Those last points could maybe be touched up with a patch as well, and just generally improve the fight, but the final suggestion I have would change the fight too drastically for it to be a likely change. Wrapping around to the beginning of the video, a major flaw with this fight is that it borderline strips the unique characteristics of each character you can play, making it so you would want to play the tankiest character, or at best maybe a character with good movement, like Duchess. So characters like Revenant or Recluse are just completely out of the picture for survivability. What I meant with changes being too drastic is that you could also expand the moveset of the normal weapons of each character. For instance, maybe Duchess's dagger could actually do long-ranging, fast dagger swings, but obviously do less damage than maybe Raider's massive hammer swing. One of the reasons why Rockhardt's boss fight works in Elden Ring was that it was basically a normal weapon but with a giant hitbox, and the entire moveset was available to you. So it is a very satisfying boss fight in my opinion. It's the kind of thing that almost feels like it's evening out the two combatants in some way. So the mechanics don't change too drastically from a normal boss fight, but you are given this huge toy to play with in the same manner, but with more perceived power. I do think the Augur Storm Ruler is better than Yorm's, as you can still use the normal attack alongside charging a powerful swing, but overall, Augur is still probably worse, because at least Yorm takes like 5 hits to kill. Augur takes way too goddamn long, as said. And Storm King is perfect, though not. But yeah, that's it. I won't talk about the latest Everdark bosses unless I have too much to say about them individually. I'll admit I'm a little nervous what they'll do for Libra. It could go either way, but at least I suspect the other fights will be better. Here's hoping.